Newsmax New York. Here on the anchor desk, my good friend and Newsmax TV political analyst Dick Morris. We're also being joined tonight from Troy, Michigan, by John Gizzi, Newsmax chief political columnist and White House correspondent, and also New York Times best-selling author, presidential historian, and Reagan biographer Craig Shirley, standing by tonight in Northern Virginia. Craig, to you, you have a great gift for capturing the historical analogies, and while it's early in the voting, your initial impressions of what is transpiring this evening.
Well, initially I would say is that the Republican Party is obviously in an internal fight, as it was in '64, between the forces of Nelson Rockefeller and the forces of Barry Goldwater. And then again in 1980, the forces of, in '76 too, with Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, and then again Reagan and Bush. But this is different. This is more, a little bit more complicated, because it's not simply the establishment versus the anti-establishment. It's the establishment versus the anti-establishment versus the populist forces at work in the party right now. Populism, American populism, overlays much of American conservatism, but not entirely. And so there's a schism there somewhat between the people who are advocating populist impulses and those who are advocating traditional American impulses. I would say that historically is that Donald Trump, you know, sometimes he reminds me of Charles Foster Kane from Citizen Kane. Yeah. But yes, right. But other times he reminds me of Wendell Willkie, because Wendell Willkie was also a business executive, Indiana Power, who came out of nowhere in 1940, and I mean nowhere, nobody knew who he was, to beat Vandenberg and beat Stassen and beat Alf Landon and Robert Taft and other establishment forces to get the Republican nomination in 1940. He didn't go on to beat Franklin Roosevelt, but he took the Republican Party off in a different direction. And again, he tried for the nomination in 1944, but he had waned by that point. But he's still, that's the closest analogy, JD, I can see right now is between Donald Trump and Wendell Willkie.
And as you offer that historical analogy, Craig Shirley, we should point out that just a minute ago, we saw a video from Jupiter, Florida, where Donald Trump fans, and here's that image again, in Jupiter, Florida, where Donald Trump supporters are awaiting the candidate. He is expected momentarily there at the podium, and as soon as he arrives, we obviously will take his comment. But speaking of the here and now, let's turn to another gentleman well-versed in political history, but equally adept at modern reportage. That is our good friend John Gizzi in Troy, Michigan, complete with his Walter Winchell-esque hat. So we've talked Wendell Willkie, Walter Winchell, John Gizzi. You were saying you were hearing from a lot of Kasich voters, but right now it appears that Donald Trump has a healthy margin in the early returns there in Michigan.
He has a healthy margin in the early returns, about 38% of the votes, slightly higher than his average in the primaries and caucuses so far. Kasich is running about 10 points behind, 28%. But just as something to underscore the remarks of Dick Morris and others earlier, Marco Rubio is dead last. I talked to Congressman John Molinar of Michigan, one of his co-chairmen here in the Water Wonderland. He said there's a lot of enthusiasm for it, but it's not clear it's at the polls. And after the Michigan results, you'll see tremendous pressure on Congressman Rubio to get out of the race. As for Kasich, he got what he wanted, which is a second-place finish that's very strong and brought out a record turnout at the polls. He will survive until Super Duper Tuesday at least and go on to win the votes of his home state, Ohio.
Not so fast, John. The polls lately have been closing. Now Kasich's at 26, Cruz at 22. And remember the time zone difference here. Your Eastern time zone, or the Western, I forget which, is slower in reporting. So you can't draw that conclusion in Michigan yet. I suspect that Cruz may take second place. And in any case, Rubio being in the 20s would be a gross disappointment. You have the situation here with Rubio and Kasich. Both of them very popular in their home states. both of them having to win their home states. Normally they would. But both of them suffering from a perception that they can't beat Donald Trump and therefore not getting the votes they normally would.
And again, Dennis Michael Lynch, the conversation comes back to frontrunner Donald Trump. You're an unabashed Trump supporter. Your analysis of what we're seeing so far, DML?
You know, you closed out the last hour talking to Dick about an exit poll. People asking, do you trust Donald Trump or not? And Dick said, you know, that's the first time I've heard of anything like that. And that's what gets Trump supporters up in arms. That's what gets Trump supporters just boiling at the neck. And that's what gets Donald Trump boiling. Why aren't they asking the question, do you trust Ted Cruz? Do you trust Marco Rubio? Do you trust anybody in D.C.? You know, whatever Trump is getting as his threshold, I guarantee you those other guys are down here. So the problem is that we keep on holding Donald Trump at this level that we're not holding other people at. Now, turning to Marco Rubio for one moment, all right, I said it last time that we were on air, and I've said it to Dick Morris many times when he appears on Unfiltered. I believe that Marco Rubio is absolutely finished as a politician. His career is over. It started with the Gang of Eight, and then he showed his true colors when he started kicking Donald Trump in the shins like a little tiny schoolboy because he wasn't getting his way. And if he stays in for Florida and he gets crushed, which he will get crushed, he is done. And there will be nobody happier in America than yours truly. Because, JD, if there are two people on this in this program right now who agree with each other 100% when it comes to legal immigration, it's you and I, brother. And Marco Rubio has no right being in the Senate as a Republican.
Well, as we compose this Newsmax TV tag team, let me turn to Craig Shirley, our presidential historian. Craig, John Gizzi made mention earlier, or perhaps it was you that made mention of the earlier campaigns. You mentioned the name of Harold Stassen, one-time boy wonder, the governor of Minnesota. That was long ago and far away. I wonder if a similar type of fate does not await Marco Rubio as a young, promising senator who got on the wrong side of some issues and now has seen this snowball.
Stassen is a very curious and sad figure from history. You're absolutely right. He was the boy wonder. He was elected as the Republican governor of Minnesota at the age of, I think, 31 against the wave of the New Deal. He actually resigned as governor to go enlist and fight in World War II. Saw many engagements, was decorated, came out. But he was always, you know, Bear Bryant used to talk about schedule luck, you know, that when his team, you know, had soft teams like Vanderbilt and then hard teams like Auburn. Well, Harold Stassen had schedule unluck because he was. It always seemed like he was up against somebody who just was a little bit more ready for the Republican nomination, whether it was Taft or it was Wendell Willkie or somebody else. So he ran so many times, obviously, and then he ran for mayor of Minneapolis, and then he ran for mayor of Philadelphia, and he ended up, you know, a sad joke. But at one time, he was considered to be a real comer and a real future leader of the National Republican Party.
Dennis Michael Lynch, I have to ask you this. Dick used the one-word answer, lethal. The Gang of Eight and amnesty for Marco Rubio. By the same token, there is a whole lot of money being spent in Florida right now. I saw one figure quoted about $70 million in television ads to tear down Donald Trump. Is there any rallying for Rubio in Florida prior to next week?
Let me match my friend Dick Morris with one word: useless. That's what that $70 million spend is. It's useless. Look at tonight. You know, you could keep on trying to knock down Donald Trump, but his supporters are going nowhere. It doesn't matter what you try to say. They are sticking with him. And in some cases, it's because people are just so frustrated. It's their way of giving the middle finger to the GOP. They said, you know what, you've been doing this to me for too long. I mean, you go back to Marco.
And speaking of this situation, Donald Trump has now stepped to the podium in Jupiter, Florida. He's projected to also win in Michigan as well as Mississippi.